Hey everyone, welcome to another lesson in photography and filmmaking. In today's episode, we're going to cover the three pillars of photo and video. We're going to talk about the three tools that you're going to use to shape every single image. And these three tools are your shutter speed, your aperture, and your ISO. Now these three settings work together and they also kind of compete against each other to shape the light in your environment. So as a quick example, let's say we're taking photographs in a dark concert hall. We're shooting a band, the band's moving really quickly and it's pretty dark in there. We're gonna have to change our settings to make sure that we freeze the motion of the band, but also have a decent quality image and we have enough of the background so people know what's going on or so that a whole person is in focus. Now, that's gonna be a pretty tricky image to make, and to do so, I would recommend having a high shutter, a low aperture, and the best ISO that we could get. Now, let's use another example. Let's say we wanted to get a landscape image, and in this landscape, we wanted things to be super thick and we wanted a really high quality. So that means that the ground in front of you is focused and the mountains in the background are focused. So how do we do that? Well, in this instance, if we want a high quality, we need the lowest possible ISO, we need the highest possible aperture or f-stop, and we need probably maybe a low shutter, which means we'll likely need a tripod. Now, this might sound a little bit confusing, but I'm gonna teach you about each of these settings and hopefully those two examples make a little bit more sense toward the end of the video. So the first one I want to talk about is the shutter speed. So the shutter speed determines how long we let light into our camera. There's actually a little door and this door opens and then closes to let light in. And the longer that little door is open, the more light goes into your camera. But when we open the door to let light in, we also kind of let time in, which is a really cool philosophical thing to think about. And when we let time into our camera, things get a little blurry because things are moving through time. So we're actually capturing this movement. And when we capture movement, it gets blurry. This is confusing, and that's why I have an example. So in our first image, we're gonna drop a little puffball. And we're gonna drop this puffball at 1/20th of a second. And you can see the puffball is really blurry. It's just a blurry line, and that's because we had that little door open for so long that the puffball traveled through time while the picture was open. And that can be cool, but it can also be really annoying. We can have photos of people that are really blurry and are really bad quality, for lack of a better word, because we didn't have the right shutter. So we need to find the right shutter that's gonna freeze time. In the second example, we're gonna leave the shutter open for 160th of a second. So it's a little bit quicker, but our puffball isn't completely frozen yet. We need to freeze time a little bit better. So let's step it up to 1/8000th of a second. That's the fastest our camera can go, and our puffball is finally crisp and clear. But how do we really accomplish that? So the way that we did it was by changing our other settings. In the first image, we used an f-stop of 6.3 and an ISO of 400. In the second, we did an f-stop of 1.4, which is gonna let even more light in, and an ISO of 400 again. In the third image, we weren't able to change our f-stop. We had to just change our ISO. So now the ISO is at 16,000. So we did accomplish freezing time, but we kind of lost quality in our image, and I'll get into that a little bit more later. All you need to know is that when you change the shutter, when you change that little duration of the door, we reduce the amount of light that gets in. So in these three examples, I'm gonna leave every setting the same, but I'm gonna change the speed of the door. So in the first setting, we have a 1/25th of the shutter, which is a pretty slow moving door, a slow moving shutter, and we can see it's a bright image. Now, if we speed the door speed up, but we don't change anything else, let's say we do 1/60th of a shutter, it's actually getting darker, but our puffball is getting more clear. And if we do it one more time, 640th of a shutter, you can see that we're freezing that puffball, but it's getting really, really dark. So we have to change one of the settings to let more light in. The next setting we'll talk about is the aperture. So the aperture is a mechanical, it's the door, but it's the size of the door. So it can either be really, really big, which is gonna let a lot of light in really, really quickly, or we can close it to like a tiny little door, which is going to let a lot of detailed light in, but it's gonna be really slow. So we're gonna let less light in, but in a really detailed way. So if we have a really wide aperture, we have a really open door to let things in. In this example, we're gonna have one of f1.4. This is the biggest door this camera has. And as you can see, everything is really blurry in the background. This is a really cool look. This makes our audience look directly at the candlestick. It tells our audience, this is what I want you to look at. And it looks crisp and whatever. It looks really cool. And a lot of cinematographers use this because it looks more cinematic. To achieve this look, we had a shutter of 1/200th. But let's say we close that door a little bit more. What happens? Now we look at a door of 7.1. That's an f-stop 7.1. That's a middle-sized hole in our camera. And we can see that things are getting a little more clear. But in order to get this clarity, we've had to change our shutter to 1/20th. So just as we said before, that little door is now gonna be open a little longer to get that kind of detail in our picture. Let's go even crazier. Let's get the most detail that we can get. So now we have a tiny little opening, f22. That's the smallest opening that my camera can do. And as you can see, it's extremely detailed. But to achieve this detail, we've had to leave our door open for 3 seconds. And this is a really long time. If I were to hold my camera, it would get really, really shaky. Just like the puffball was really blurry, holding your camera open for 3 seconds is gonna create a ton of blur. So we can only really use this 3 seconds if things are really still. If we're on a tripod, if our subject isn't really moving, like these candlesticks aren't really moving, so they could be crisp, but we have the freedom to leave our camera there. Let's say we have to move our camera like we did in the band example. The people in the band are moving, so we can't have a really slow shutter because they would be blurry. Plus we're holding our camera, so we would create blur if we were using a 3-second shutter. So we have to have a 3-second shutter, and our aperture only goes down to 1.4, but it's still too dark to capture the band. In this instance, we're gonna have to change our ISO. And what the ISO is it's the sensitivity of the film or the sensor, the digital sensor that's on our camera. It used to be film, but now everything's digital. So that means when light comes through our camera, through the door, regardless of the size, how fast does it kind of absorb that light like a sponge? So if we have an ISO of 100, it doesn't really absorb it that quickly. It really takes its time to gather light, and that gives it a really good quality. The longer we can gather light, the more we can decide, you know, where things are in our image, and we don't need to be as noisy. If we need to gather information really quickly, we're probably gonna make mistakes, and that's why the higher your ISO is, let's say we had an ISO of 1000, things are gonna get a little bit grainier. It's just in such a rush to collect the light that it does kind of a worse job of doing it. So I have a couple examples of the ISO grain. So here we are at 100th ISO, and things are pretty clean. Things are looking really good. This is almost where you always wanna be. But like the band example, there's so many times where we're not going to be able to shoot at 100th of an ISO. So let's step it up a notch. We're going to go to 1/800th of an ISO. I don't know why I said 1, it's just 800. This is probably where most of your photos will take place, especially in the evenings or when things are a little bit darker, but we still need to have a lot of shutter. And this is a completely acceptable image. We do have some grain, we have some like mud and noise, but for most of our viewers, this is completely fine. Now, let's say this was a real amateur band and they were playing in a basement with one single light on. It's super dark. There's almost no light at all. We need to shoot at a ridiculous ISO. We need to shoot at the highest ISO. This is 51,200th of an ISO. And as you can see, it is a grain nightmare. It is total, not looking very good. But in some cases, it's better to have the image than to have no images at all. This band hired you to take the photos. You can't have it be really blurry, so we're gonna have it be really grainy. Or maybe there's a situation where we could shoot at the minimum shutter that I would recommend, which is 1/50th of a second, the minimum aperture, and then we can bring that ISO down to maybe that 800 that we wanted before. It kind of depends on the situation that you're in. And this situation is going to get even worse for us because I want to talk about these 3 settings while filmmaking. So even though I went through all the heartache and pain of explaining what all 3 of these things do, in filmmaking, we actually can't even really change these settings that much. For example, the shutter speed almost always needs to follow the frames per second. So if we can, we want to have a shutter speed that is doubled our frames per second. So if our frames per second is 24, then we want to shoot at a 50th of a shutter. If our frames per second is 60 frames per second, then we want to shoot at 120th of a shutter. That's where things look the absolute best. Now, can we deviate from this? Of course. If we do increase our shutter, we can make our image darker, and sometimes that's what we have to do. That's a decision that we have to make, but at least we know enough to know that we're making that decision. The same thing is true with the aperture. If we want a really blurred background in our film, we need to have a wide aperture. But if we start filming outside in the bright sun, we're gonna have to change something. If we can't change our shutter, then we have to change the aperture. We have to make our background thicker in order to give us a proper exposed image, which is really what we're going for. The last thing we could change is the ISO. So if we're filming in a really dark space, we can't change our shutter, we want a blurry aperture, we're gonna have to crank our ISO so that we get a perfect image. There's one more tool we can use, and it is a sunglass, or it's a filter really. And this little filter is an item we can buy for our camera in order to change the way we look at light, just like a sunglass would change the way light comes into our face. This is called a variable neutral density filter, and as you can see, as I spin it, it's kind of tricky, but as I spin it, I'm letting more light in. So if you're looking at my face, I can spin it, and now my face is a lot darker. And this is really great if we want to keep our settings exactly the same. And often in filmmaking, we want to keep our settings the same because we want our film to look consistent so that this illusion of things happening at the exact same place and at the exact same time stays the same. So here's an image that I shot at the proper film settings of 1/50th of a shutter, 2.0 aperture, and 400 ISO, which is a native ISO to the cameras, which I'll get into in a second. So I want to keep these settings, and in this image, things look pretty good. But let's say I want to make it a little bit darker. I can change the filter, keep the exact same settings, and now my image is darker. If I were to move my camera outside, like in this image, I can use the filter again to keep the settings the same, make my image darker, and things look great. Settings are the same, image is properly exposed, and just to bring it home, I'm gonna take the filter off, and now you can see how bright it is with the same settings and no filter at all. And that's pretty bright. Now, the other thing that sucks about filmmaking, especially for us because we're going to be filming on our iPhone, is that some things can't be changed. And by some things, I mean the ISO and the aperture. Now, our iPhones don't give us the ability to change our aperture. Some of the lenses have slightly different apertures, but they're always gonna be pretty close to the same, 1.8, 2.0. Those are really wide open apertures that we can't really adjust. And that means that we almost always need to use one of these filters. The next thing I'll want to talk about is the ISO. So in filmmaking, there's something called a native ISO, and that is the best ISO to edit with. It's going to bring back the highlights and the shadows the best and be the best quality. And interestingly enough, it's not going to be 100. It's going to be something like 400 or 800. So depending on your camera, you need to look up your native ISO, and that's going to be the ISO that you almost always need to film at. So if you're outside, 800 of an ISO is extremely high, and you almost always need to use one of these filters in order to film at that ISO level. Now, let's say you're filming outside, you want to keep 1/50th of a shutter, you want to keep a wide open aperture, but you don't have a filter. What do we do? In this instance, I would probably recommend changing the ISO to be 100. I think that there's enough software to fix, a grainy image or to make your image look a little bit better. There's no software to change a shutter, a really bad shutter, or a really bad aperture. So try to keep those in the best position possible to get the best film, and then, figure it out later in post how you're going to fix the ISO. If you're in a situation where like you're 100 ISO, you have like the only shutter that the iPhone provides, and it's still too bright, then you're just gonna have to change the shutter, but that's gonna be a last resort. So that seems like a pretty long-winded video, but I feel like we've covered these three settings in a pretty good way. If you have a photography camera, I highly recommend trying these things out in photography because it's a really great way to learn and a really great way to see the differences. But unfortunately, this is a film project, so try to keep those settings where I said they should be for your film. But if you need to deviate, by all means, do whatever it takes to get a really nicely exposed image. If you have any questions, please let me know. This is a really complicated topic, so I wouldn't be surprised if you had questions. So you can leave them in the description, or you can send me a message or whatever. Anyways, I'm losing my voice, so I'll see you in the next one.